Okay, next up we have Ken Baerenklau. Now Ken is a water economist. So he's going to talk to us about why water costs what it does and water pricing and how consumers respond to the different prices in terms of conservation. And Ken is an Associate Professor of Environmental Economics and Policy in the School of Public Policy and the Associate Provost of UC Riverside. So he's over in Riverside. He's a member of this great institution, the University of California, Riverside. He also is a cooperating faculty member in the Departments of Economics and Environmental Sciences and the Adjunct Fellow of the Water Policy Center of Public Policy Institute of California. And he sits on a number of boards and writes a bunch, and he's our water expert. So Ken, tell us why we're facing the increases we're facing and what they do to our consumption and whatever else you can.
Well, that's going to be some big shoes to fill, but I'll see if I can do it. So thanks for having me. My name is Ken Baerenklau, and I'm going to talk about pricing. In fact, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the very price mechanism that Adam had done some of his surveying on. Sometimes it's called water budgets. I refer to it as allocation-based rates. So I'll talk a little bit about different ways to price water, the challenge of doing it well, and then spend some time describing how these innovative water budget rate structures have affected water demand in a couple Southern California water districts that we've been working with on some research projects. So I'm going to start by putting a question up here that I'm not going to answer. How should water be priced? That's actually a tough question. Instead of giving you an answer, I'm going to talk about the factors that agencies think about, competing factors, when they're trying to decide not just what the price level should be, but what kind of rate structure to use. And here's a few of them that I put up here. Three things that I think if you talk to most any agency would be on their list of the different things that they're trying to balance. And the first one is something economists refer to as efficiency. And what we mean is that prices are used throughout our economy for various reasons, but one of the nice things that prices do is they send a signal to consumers that if you want to consume more, if you want to buy more, somebody else has got to make a sacrifice. Maybe it's the water district that has to deliver that water to you and there's a cost associated with it. Maybe there's an agricultural producer who's going to forego that water so it can stay in the statewide system and come down here to Southern California for somebody to use. But there's a sacrifice, there's an opportunity cost, right? And that signal tends to cause resources to be put to their most highly valued uses, all right? Because as the price goes up, it's only those users with those high values who will continue to agree to pay that price. Lower valued uses no longer make economic sense, right? And this idea goes back to this famous economist, Adam Smith, who referred to this as the invisible hand of the market back in his famous book in 1776. And so this idea permeates our economy, and prices are a widely relied upon resource allocation mechanism. So when we talk about efficiency, we're talking about sending signals to the economy that cause our limited resources to go to the most highly valued uses, and that includes water. So that's one thing that we care about is sending the right signal about water scarcity and encouraging its use in highly valued places and discouraging it in lower valued places. Another thing that water districts care about is equity. So we can talk about, on the one hand, higher prices perhaps being good because they send that signal about water scarcity, but if you don't have much of an ability to pay for water, that's not good for you. And so water districts care a lot about equity too, and ensuring affordability for essential uses. And so you can start to see that there's already this conflict where you might like to raise prices when water is scarce during a drought to send that signal that there's an opportunity cost of using water today, and it's higher than it was when we had full reservoirs. But you'd also like to keep water prices low in order to ensure affordability for disadvantaged communities. Third, you'll hear a lot about financial stability. And it might be the case that neither a high price nor a low price is going to cause the balance sheet for your agency to clear. You might get excess profits with a high price, you might run a deficit with a low price. And so these three things are in competition with each other, and there's more things that we could put on the list as well. But these are just three to give you an idea of why setting a price is a challenging thing to do. You're trying to send an efficiency signal, you're trying to be fair, you're trying to balance your budget, and you've got this one instrument that you're using, your price structure, okay? So a challenging thing to do, and that's why I'm not going to answer the question. So, some common ways that agencies try to go about setting rates. And so I'm going to go through 4 different rate structures that are fairly common and then talk about their commonality in California. So first of all, one approach is a flat rate, and that's just where every customer gets a fixed bill every month. Okay? One reason why that's good is because that is close to the cost structure of an agency. It's largely fixed costs. So Adam also addressed that. He talked about the fact that customers seem to realize that agencies have high fixed costs. And in terms of achieving financial stability, you'd like to have a fixed component of your revenues to cover the fixed component of your costs, right? But if we've got all of our revenue wrapped up in a flat rate, a fixed cost, we're sending a very low scarcity signal through our price to our customers that water is scarce. So one way we can get around that problem is to switch from a flat rate to a uniform rate. And a lot of you may pay a uniform rate around here. That's where you have to pay per unit, but the cost per unit is constant. You can consume as much as you want, and you keep paying $2 per unit, no matter how much you consume. Well, one of the problems with that is that if we'd like to raise the rate when water gets scarce, we run into an equity problem, right? We're raising the rates on everyone, rates are going up, and we might have some customers that have a really hard time paying. They're trying to keep their water use down, and they're still subject to these high rates. So one of the things that agencies have done to innovate in that regard is to introduce what's called an increasing block rate. And this looks like a staircase, okay? So if you use just a little bit of water, you pay a low price per unit. But if you start to use more water, it jumps up to a higher price per unit. And if you use even more water, it jumps up again. Okay, so if you do have customers who only want a little bit of water because they have a low ability to pay for that water, then they get to pay a low rate per unit as well. And that seems, most people would say that seems pretty fair, that seems pretty equitable. And then if you're going to be a large consumer of water and put additional stress on that delivery system, you're going to start paying higher and higher prices for more and more water that you use. And again, I think a lot of people would say, seems fair. Well, one problem with that, again, gets back to this idea that we want to use prices to send signals about scarcity. And if you have some people consuming in that first tier where there's low prices, and other people consuming in that last tier where there's high prices, they face different messages about the relative scarcity of water. The people in the low tier might think, oh, prices are low, water, we must have a lot of water, we're going to keep using more. And that's not necessarily a good thing from this societal perspective of efficiency. And so one of the most recent pricing innovations is to take that staircase, right? And instead of telling everybody that every household gets 10 units at the low price, 10 units at the middle price, and the rest of it at the high price, you adjust those volumes based on household characteristics. So if you have a small household, you're going to get less water at the lowest price. If you have a big household, meaning you have a lot of people who live there, you're going to get more water at the lowest price, okay? And then if you have, the second tier is usually used for outdoor water uses. So if you have a small yard, we figure, well, you don't have much use for outdoor water, so you don't get much water in that next tier. But if you have a large yard, a swimming pool, you live on a big lot, we think you need more water to maintain your landscaping, and so you get more water in that second tier. And so those tiers, the sizes of those blocks, the sizes of the steps, if you will, the widths of the steps, are responsive to household characteristics, and they're also responsive to environmental characteristics. So if you live here in the Coachella Valley where it's hot, you would get more water for a given sized lawn than you would if you lived in coastal Orange County, where it's not so hot and there's more moisture in the air. So again, this seems to be a pretty reasonable, pretty fair approach to pricing water and allocating water. How do we do it around the state? Well, there was a survey done by PPIC. It's getting a little bit old now, but we don't have any newer data on this that I'm aware of. And so back in 2005, and I believe this was a survey of the aqua agencies, we had about half of all public utilities were using increasing block rates. So they were using those staircases with fixed width steps for every customer, about half of public utilities. As of 2008, fewer than 14 utilities statewide were using these allocation-based rates. That's not many at all, pretty unpopular at that time. But then we had Governor Schwarzenegger's 20 by 2020 California Water Conservation Plan. The goal was a 20% reduction across the state by 2020. And we saw sort of this uptick in interest in allocation-based rates. So from 2009 to 2011, we had 9 more utilities adopt allocation-based rates. And since then, since we've had the more recent drought, the emergency or the executive order, I mean, we've seen another uptick in interest, especially amongst Southern California water agencies. So, still though, why the apparent reluctance to adopt what seems like sort of an innovative, fair, potentially efficient way to allocate water? And there are some reasons. One is there's some short-term costs in terms of adopting this new rate structure. You need to have a lot more information about your customers. You have to have information about how many people are living there, the local climate, how much lawn they have, those sorts of things. There's a longer-term financial risk because you're switching from something you know, your old rate structure, to something you don't know, and it's still pretty innovative, so there's sort of that early adopter risk. There's some legal questions. Prop 218 is one of those. But last, and the thing I'm going to focus on today, is that at the time that we started doing our studies, which I'll talk about next, people didn't really know if it was worth the trouble. You can go through all this cost and risk, and are you really going to get any conservation out of these new rate structures? And so that's sort of the question that we're going to address for the rest of my time. So a couple case studies I'm going to present for you, two different agencies that adopted these allocation-based or water budget-based rates. One is Eastern Municipal Water District, which is just in western Riverside County, and the other is Molten-Miguel Water District down in Orange County. And I won't go through all the details on these slides, but Eastern switched from uniform rates, which is that uniform flat price per unit, no matter how much you consume, to allocation-based rates in April of 2009. And what this shows you here is that they have 4 different price tiers. This is the lowest price tier, and I think most recently this price was just under $2 per 100 cubic feet. This is the highest price tier. These are their words, by the way: indoor, outdoor, excessive, and wasteful. I think they had another term, abusive, but their customers didn't like it, so they changed that. This is the highest price tier, and most recently this, I think, is close to $12 per 100 cubic feet. So there's a big difference between the lowest price and the highest price. And these formulas just show you how you calculate how much water you get in each one of those tiers. So to figure out how much water you get at the lowest price, they look at your household size, your per person allowance, and some other factors here. To calculate your outdoor water use budget, they look at evapotranspiration, which is a measure of climate. They have a conversion factor. This is the amount of irrigated area that you have, and some other parameters as well. These two things together are called your water budget. And if you go above your water budget, you get into these penalty tiers. So the goal was to promote water conservation while they maintained their fiscal balance. And the question that we wanted to answer was, well, how much conservation did they really get by switching from that old rate structure to this new one? So we conducted a study, and just so you know what we're talking about, here's the Eastern Municipal Water District. There's Riverside right there. And this is Molten-Miguel, it's a smaller district down there. And here's all the households in Eastern service area. There's a Diamond Valley Lake, and there's Lake Paris. All the yellow dots are households that are in our study. So we collected a long data set going back to 2008, I think it was, maybe before that. And we looked at household use from 2008 through the rate structure change into a couple years past the rate structure change. And what we basically did was we built this statistical model to describe household demand under the old rate structure, and then we used it to predict what we think demand would have been had the water agency not changed their rates, but had they maintained that old rate structure and adjusted the price just a little bit to control for the fact that people paid on average a little bit more for water under the new rate structure. So we're kind of going to predict this hypothetical situation and say, suppose they didn't switch, what do we think would have happened? So this slide just shows you the difference between our model, which is the blue line, and the red line, which is actual water consumption in Eastern service area. You see it bounces up and down a lot because of seasonality, summertime irrigation. You can also see that we can do a pretty good job of describing demand. So hopefully that has you convinced that we can also do a good job of predicting demand under that scenario where they didn't change their rate structure. And that's what this next slide is going to show you. So on the next slide, you're going to see this same data, but I'm going to smooth it out over the seasons so you won't see it bounce up and down so much. And you'll see our predictions. So this is the data on the previous slide, but I've smoothed it out over the course of a year so you don't see the seasonality. This is the rate structure change. This is what demand actually did. It dropped off and it stayed kind of low. And this blue line is what we think demand would have done if they hadn't changed their rates. We think it would have dropped because prices went up a little bit. We also had the recession. Incomes went down a little bit. We also had some beneficial changes in the weather. But then we think that it would have rebounded and come back up here, but it didn't. And so this difference here, we attribute to the new policy, the new rate structure. And that difference is about 10 to 15%. So a 10 to 15% reduction, and the average price of water only went up by 3%. If they were to have tried to achieve this reduction, this 10 to 15% reduction with the old rate structure, they would have had to raise prices by about 30% in order to get there. So good for the customers, good in terms of conservation. Here, if we break up that rate structure effect, if you will, that sort of conservation effect that they got out of their rate structure change, we can break it up according to how efficient different households are in terms of water consumption. And what this slide shows you is that the more efficient households, well, most recently, at least in the most recent data that we have, the most efficient households are this blue line, and they're only about 5% below where we think they'd be under the old rates. The least efficient households are about 25 to 30% below where we think they would be under the old rates. So the district was glad to hear this because they have been telling their customers, trust us, if you're already an efficient water user, this policy change isn't going to affect you very much. It's going to affect the people who are inefficient users because they're the ones who end up in the higher price tiers. And that looks like it's exactly what happened. Okay, let me say something. So this is what we call a demand effect, right? It sort of describes how people responded in terms of how much water they wanted to consume. That's one way we can measure the effect of the policy. The other way we can measure the effect of the policy is with this economic concept of welfare. And I don't mean like social welfare programs. I mean like measuring people's well-being, okay? So the sort of the analog here is that if someone does something bad to you, right, you can potentially take them to court and we can legitimately talk about compensation that would make you whole again, right? Well, if a policy affects you negatively, we can also talk about compensation that would make you as well off as you were before the policy change. And if a policy makes you better off, we can equivalently talk about sort of how much compensation we might take away from you to get you back to where you were before the policy change. So economists use currency as a way to measure changes in well-being, all right? It doesn't mean that all the people value is money. We just use currency as the measurement, okay? So we did the similar analysis with this rate structure. We said, well, I wonder how much better off or worse off the customers were under this rate structure change versus how much better off or worse off they'd be under the old policy with that flat or that uniform rate. So I got a bunch of numbers on this table, but I just want to point out to you a couple of them. This number right here, this positive number, means that on average, the customers in Eastern Municipal Water District were made better off by that rate structure change. Prices went up a little bit on average. Some people undoubtedly feel like they've been made worse off. But on average, all throughout the district, the average response was a positive response in terms of welfare. Consumers feel like they're a little bit better off on average than they used to be. Compare that to what their old rate structure would have been, and you see a negative number right here. Consumers would have been made worse off on average if they had used their old rate structure to achieve the same conservation. So they're achieving this conservation. The most inefficient users are largely the ones who are doing the conservation and who are suffering in a welfare sense. But the other customers, the average customers, are actually turning out positive for them. Okay, so here's the other case study. We did the same thing to Molten Miguel Water District down in Orange County. They had a similar situation where they went from, although this time they went from a fixed increasing block rate to a budget-based increasing block rate. And we've got the same graph here where we've got their observed consumption in blue. It was dropping before the rate change. It rebounded a little bit, and then it kind of leveled off after the rate change. That dashed line right there shows where the rates changed. The orange line, again, is our model. And what we think would have happened for Molten Miguel is that they would have seen this big increase in consumption under the old rates, and then it would have gone away. And most recently, we don't see much difference at all between the old rate structure and the new rate structure. So what this looks to me like is what people in the electricity world call peak shaving, right? Because if I were to show you what the weather looked like from about, September of 2011 through June of 2013, in that area there was this unusually warm, dry period, okay? And it appears in the evapotranspiration data, and it maps exactly onto this bump right here. But then things got back to normal, and it looks like there's really no difference between consumption under the old rates and consumption under the new rates. But the nice thing is they saved about 5,000 acre-feet of water during this event right here by being under the new rate structure. So we started asking ourselves, why the difference between Eastern's results and Molten Miguel's results? Why the bump versus the persistent effect? Well, when we break it down by inefficient users, we looked at the inefficient users in Molten Miguel. Here's what we get, and it's the same story. There's this persistent conservation effect of this rate structure, but this time it's only on the most inefficient users rather than on the typical user in their service area. And there's some reasons for that. Eastern's users were less inefficient on average to begin with, and those inefficient users were relatively more wasteful than the inefficient users in Molten's service area. So they basically had, more room for improvement, and they made more improvement, whereas the improvement from Molten's service area was more limited to those people who were only inefficient to begin with. But there's also some differences in the rates that they adopted, and I'll show you what the rate structures look like. So here's that staircase I mentioned, and what we did was we picked a household that had characteristics that wouldn't be surprising to find in either Molten service area or Eastern service area, and we calculated the sizes of those blocks. So these are the volumetric sizes of the blocks, and then these are the prices up here. So in Eastern service area, the orange line, you see that prices are below $2 up until about 900 cubic feet per month. Then they jump up to, I don't know what this is, between $2 and $3. Over here to about 2,300 cubic feet per month. Then they jump up above 4 and eventually up here. Molten's price structure is a little bit different for the same household, okay? It stays lower initially, but eventually it gets a lot higher. So there's bigger penalties for people who are, let's just call it, wasting a lot of water. But it's more generous for people who are moderately efficient water users, okay? And this probably has something to do with those results also. That because Eastern is a bit more aggressive through this region right here, where more customers find themselves located, those customers are inclined to conserve more. Molten Miguel is a little bit more generous through that region. They're conserving a bit less. More evidence that prices work and that people are particularly focused on getting out of these highly priced tiers so that their water bills stay low. All right, so that's actually what I had prepared for today. I'll just give a quick summary. What we saw in our research is demand reductions of up to 15% consistently through time, persistent reductions, and up to 30% by inefficient users across these two water districts. Those are pretty significant, especially when you put them in the perspective of what the State Water Resources Control Board has asked the state to achieve, or I guess the governor has asked the state to achieve. We see larger reductions when the initial inefficiency of users is lower, and larger reductions when those middle tier prices are lower or more generous. So this is all consistent with what we would expect. We also see some evidence that the reductions by these inefficient users are resilient in the sense that when prices decline a little bit, when the economy rebounds a little bit, when the weather changes, they don't use as much water as we would think that they would under those conditions. And it suggests that maybe there's some habit formation going on. That these higher prices cause people to take actions they wouldn't otherwise take, and then they realize, oh, that's not so bad. Save some water, water bill went down, feel good about what I'm doing for the environment and for other people in the state. I think I might just keep this habit. And then conditions change and you think you're going to see a rebound, and you don't see as much of a rebound as you would expect. I can't say for sure that's what is happening, but that's consistent with what we see in the data. And I think I already mentioned this last point here, which is that in Eastern service area, and unfortunately I don't have the same statistic for Molten Miguel, the real average price only rose by about 3% after that policy change. That's not much when you think about typical inflation rates. But it would have had to rise 30% under the old price structure to get the same demand effect that we observe in the data. So again, I think this speaks to the conservation potential of this particular type of rate structure, while also, as I said at the beginning, addressing concerns about equity. So thanks very much, and I guess I'm sticking around to answer questions.